So you've probably all studied some counterpoint in college, right? With the Gradus ad Parnassum, Fuchs's species counterpoint. I was talking to emailing one of my fellow students from graduate school at UCSB, and he earned a doctorate in theory, music theory, and ended up being a dean at another college, music theory. And I asked him, I said, most in the Western species counterpoint, and he said, no. We pretty much couldn't find romantic periods who didn't study it. Even Schoenberg was a very strong advocate of this point because he thought of how it trained your brain. Even though he was teaching students to write atonal music, he thought they needed that same foundation. So species counterpoint has been used. It was the only theoretical text in Bach's library that could find in Gradus ad Parnassum, which is species counterpoint. And that means like steps to Parnassus, like steps to inspiration. What was really unique about Fuchs, there were many books like it beforehand, but they were all very theoretical. His is theoretical, but also very practical at the same time. And it takes you through a journey talking between professor and student. There are two students, and what the professor represents Palestrina's school of thought and the Renaissance, and the student represents the common practice way of thinking. So when they have a disagreement and they say, well, yes, you could do that, the professor says, well, yeah, this way or that, it's representing, oh, we should fill in the chord with the third when we have a choice. That's the more new way of thinking, whereas the fifth in the Renaissance way of thinking. So he's trying to represent, there are some different nuances between the different ways, schools of thought. You have it right with you. Yeah, so that's the famous text. That's one I recommended to you, Susan. That's what everybody studies in college. And even if the teacher doesn't give you the book, you still do some of the exercises. So I remember when I was younger and I thought about harmony, I thought of block chords. And I didn't really understand how melodies came together to create harmony. And so once I did understand that better, I really fell in love with counterpoint. And I wanted my students, when they're learning, not to be stuck thinking how I was with just very horizontally, one chord, but understanding how melodies come together to create harmony. And it's also the rhythmic relationships between the parts. So what I've done with a lot of my students, especially the AP students, is walked them through, broke down the species counterpoint to much smaller steps so they can improvise with it. Because if you just say improvise in the first species counterpoint, that's overwhelming for most people. But I found even with younger children who are really creative and insightful, they can handle going through this, and it changes their perspective. And we'll look at Bach and say, look, there's parallel thirds, 6/3, voice exchange, and then it ends with a fifth and an octave. They're like, this is species counterpoint, and they can just see it in their music, so they're not just analyzing. Like one of my theory teachers said, you don't want to just label everything and not understand how they connect, right? So understanding counterpoint helps us see how they connect. So I would like some steps here. So it's technically, if we just do parallel thirds, it's not counterpoint, but I start that simple. Parallel third, going from unison to parallel thirds, octave to parallel six, ending on the octave, and then mixing them up, and then starting to add other intervals gradually. And even with a student I introduced to this week, she made it through most of these steps. 2 students I did this week for the first time, they could improvise with suspensions and passing tones, voice exchanges, which is pretty neat, right? So so let's break this down. I don't know how this is gonna work with the piano. And if you're looking for interesting videos on counterpoint, Jacob Gran was a professor I was in touch with, and he does some really neat videos on counterpoint online. So I'll just demonstrate briefly, and I'll ask for a volunteer. We're just gonna go through some steps. So this is, like I said, this is not counterpoint yet. But if we start with the unison, imagine two singers singing in unison and then splitting to thirds, and then having parallel thirds, maybe even using two hands to feed into the illusion of two singers. And then have them resolve to a unison by step. That seems very basic, but part of what makes a perfect authentic cadence is having both melodic parts early on. This is how they would do it. Resolve home, and actually you'll see in Beethoven and Mozart, they'll still sometimes resolve to just like an alla turca, resolve to a single note. You're like, well, how can they have A, right, at the cadence? There's no third even, right? But everything's going home. So what you would have is these two parts resolving home. And when they added a third voice below, the only one that harmonizes is the G. And then that would go home by the strong harmonic interval of a fifth, while the upper parts resolve by step to home. Well, there's more to the history of the perfect authentic cadence than that. But let's try. Does somebody want to try that first step? Debbie, do you want to try it, or anyone else?
Thank you.
Gary?
Wait, how you hold it on top of your head?
Well, you want to try it, Stephen, or you can do it. But we're just going to improvise. It'll be very simple. We're starting very simple.
Okay.
Okay, so what I encourage you when you, with students too, when you introduce them to intervals, even at a young level, you can say, look at these parallel thirds, they sound nice. Okay, so let's just start with it. Imagine you have two singers singing in unison, and then switch to thirds, and then move around with however you want. And then the only requirement is when you end, you need to hug C from both sides, and then go to C at the end.
Okay, see.
Well, this thirds for now. We'll have more intervals later. Yeah, there we go.
Okay.
Now, let's do the same thing with octaves. So start with an octave here. I'll show you real quick. So something I learned in Scouts is the EDGE method of educating. Educate, demonstrate, guide, and empower or encourage. It's really useful. So you can show them and then have them do it, or talk about it, show them, and then have them do it. Okay, so we start with the octave, then we use parallel six. Sorry, are you messed up? Notice when they both walk home to the octave, not only do you have the strength of the octave saying we're done with the phrase, but you also have the stepwise motion going into that. And the contrary motion into the perfect interval, really giving that groundedness. So go ahead and try. So even though this isn't like full counterpoint, at least we're learning some ideas at this point. So then, yes, go from octaves to sixths.
Okay, octave. Wait. So
start with one octave, start at home, then have them both, and then go to a sixth.
Okay. Oh, okay.
And then only parallel six until you're done.
Oh, okay.
And end by stepping back to the octave. And so perfect intervals are the most stable ones. Well, the fifths and octaves, unisons, fourths not so much. And the thirds and sixths, the imperfect consonances, have a mathematical. Okay, the mathematical ratio of an octave is 2 to 1. The two frequencies. It's double the frequency. So you have A 440, and then A 220, and 110, and 55, and 22 and a half. So it's all logarithmic. So fifths or a 3 to 2 ratio, so pretty simple. And even organ stops, you can use an octave and a fifth, right? So once you go to the thirds and sixths, the ratios change so that you have a 5 in the number. So a major third is a 5/4, a minor third is 6/5, major sixth is 5/3, and a minor sixth is 8/5, right? Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that's right. So these are all the mathematical ratios. Notice all of the imperfect consonances have a 5 in the ratio. All of the perfect consonances do not. They're more simple than that. and they fit within the Pythagorean tuning. But so anyway, we resolve to the more stable intervals, and the ones that have a little bit of friction, not too hot, not too cold, are like the meat and potatoes, right? And then the more dissonant ones, like a minor second, which is a 15/16 ratio, that's a lot of friction between the two frequencies. Those are the ones that add spice and drive to the music and expression, right? So every interval is good in counterpoint. It's just you're using the interval for how in different functions. So it's like everything has a place, but in a different place. So, okay, so you already did the sixth. Now what we're gonna do is mix up thirds and sixths. There's three ways we can mix up thirds and sixths. We can have them go in contrary motion, right? Which I think of as nestle. This is just my own term. The contrary motion is the normal term. But if I go from a sixth and I have a third inside of it, it's like it's contrary motion is the preferred motion for counterpoint. If you only do contrary motion, it'll sound too dependent, but you want to have more contrary motion ideally than other types of motion, right? For it to sound independent. And so if you have a third hidden within the sixth, you have that contrary motion. You also have that sense of the breathing, right? The sort of expansion and contraction. And so that's very desirable for counterpoint. So let's try that. If you start with an octave and then go to a sixth, and then find a third within that sixth, you only have two within it, right? You have two options. And then what we'll do is we'll go to other options too. So start with an octave statement, and then go to sixth, and then find a third within that sixth.
Third, wait.
Inside of it. No, without including the same note.
Oh, okay.
If you include the same note, that's called oblique motion.
Okay.
And then you move, alternate thirds and sixths, moving however you want.
Oh, okay.
So it's sort of not very many options right now, but look at the options. It's already pretty, right? Yeah. And then when you want to end, go from the sixth to the octave and make sure it's the sixth.
Okay.
Yeah, you can keep going a little farther, and then you could step out from there.
And then
go backwards, actually. Let me go down. So
yeah.
Now use it. The third. And then go to a sixth down. And go to this third.
Okay. Oh, and then.
Yeah, but you want to end on an octave.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, but we want to end from here to the octave.
Okay.
So find your way to the, yes, step. There you go. Yeah. So that in counterpoint, you would always end stepwise going into the octave where you listen. So because that's stable, right? You can hear how it sounds stable. So the other ways you can use thirds to sixths is one to keep a note, but that would be a different species of counterpoint where you have one note held and the other one moving. So we'll address that later. The other one is they both go in the same direction, similar motion. It's very dramatic because one of the parts ends up leaping and the other one stepping, right? So you end up having, if they both go in the same direction, to go from a third to a sixth, one leaps and one steps, and they both go in the same direction. So it's not a very balanced motion, it's a more dramatic motion, but you don't necessarily want everything to be the same. That contrary motion is preferred, but also variety is preferred. If you only do the same thing over and over again, so you're constantly balancing like preferences, like thirds and sixths. Well, I want some variety, so I'm going to use some fifths, or right. I want contrary motion, but I want variety, so I'm going to use some parallel and direct motion. Because if you only use if you only have your favorite food every meal, you're going to get tired of it, right? And in the Renaissance, that's what they preferred, right? And this comes from Renaissance aesthetics, trying to blend in. It was written during the Baroque period to try to blend in with the current practices in the Baroque period. Bach loved it. Everybody loved it. It was a breakthrough in how they taught counterpoint, how counterpoint was taught. So now, yeah, you can also do. So now you can do those nestled thirds and sixths, but you could also like step up to a sixth, right? So if I wanted to go right where they both go in the same direction, here's a sixth. And I'll give you one other option. You can also use parallel thirds and sixths. Okay. So I'll show you what this could help. Now this makes it a lot more complicated. So I'm gonna. already starts to feel like a classical composition, and we haven't even added other intervals yet. Go ahead and so you start with an octave.
Okay.
And then you can use parallel thirds and sixths.
Parallel.
You can use those nestled ones where contrary motions, or you can go similar motion, direct motion. There's two similar motion, direct motion and parallel motion. Right, Gary, correct me if I'm wrong. So
here's an octave. Okay.
Yeah.
There you go.
Yeah, so that would be a pretty dramatic move. Usually when you make a bold move, that's fine. When you make a bold move, you usually, when you create gaps, you usually fill them in. There were three types of early chant. All I remember was Gregorian chant and Andalusian. Do you remember what the third one was? Okay, so out of those two, Andalusian tended to wiggle, and Middle Eastern music tends to come more out of that tradition. And Gregorian chant would have leaps and gaps and then fill in the gaps. And that became the more of the European tradition. So when you create a gap, you fill it in. Right? You rarely have a melody that has only stepwise motion. No leaps. You could probably find examples, but it's not as common, right? So yeah, use those leaps, but then fill them in. Actually, in the Renaissance, they would only prefer like consonant leaps.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, and there you go. There you go. Go to the octave. Good. So good. So the next step will be another. You're doing awesome. You're doing awesome. Want to try with. So the next is we're going to include tenths, which is just thirds plus an octave. And then I always ask my students, well, why 8 plus 3? That's 11. Why does it add up to 10? Because we double count the note in the middle, right? So all inversions, all compound intervals, you're going to have an extra number because when you count up to 8 and you count from 8, you count that middle note twice. It's same with all inversions up to 9, and 6 and thirds, seconds and sevenths, fifths and fourths. They add up to 9. They should add up to 8, but we double count the middle notes, so you end up with 9, right? So like if I'm counting from C to G, and then G to C, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4. Well, I double counted G. So anyway, so tenths, third plus an octave. So let's just start with an octave and then go to tenths. Now tenths sound a little hollow up high, but where do tenths sound good? Gary, you know where they sound good. They sound great down low, right? Because thirds sound muddy down low.
Yeah.
But tenths sound fantastic down low. So because of the overtone series, voicings tend to be more spread out low, right? That's how resonance works. So when you get to the low range, also we hear clearest in the vocal range. So once you start going south of the vocal range, it's harder to discern the intervals. Hopefully you don't have a ear training test where they're testing the very bottom octave of the piano or the very top octave. It's harder to discern for our brain as you go farther from the vocal range because we're designed to hear humans, right? So as you go low, tenths and octaves sound a lot better and fifths, not so much thirds or even sixths. Okay, so go ahead and just do this low. Okay, start with the low, start with an octave and switch to tenths.
Okay, so then there's a tenth.
Just all parallel tenths for a moment. And then you can resolve back to an octave. Normally they call that an octave factor check. Octave, but that's what we're stuck with for a moment. Good, perfect. Okay, so now we're going to start with, now we're going to alternate thirds and sixths. Sorry, tenths and sixths. So if you go from a tenth to a sixth, notice if you have it in contrary motion, you have 3 options. Out of those 3 options, they're all good, but one of them is amazing. And let's see if you can figure out why.
Wait,
you already amazing. Yeah, that you figured it out already. Why is that one amazing? What notes do you have? Tell us what notes you have. C and E. We'll do what you did before.
What did I wait?
You went to E and C.
I went E. Oh, that's right, yeah.
E and C. So what happens C, E, and C? That's a voice exchange. If you go back and look at the Alfred books and the early books, and you analyze the intervals between the parts, or if you look at even preparatory level literature from Faber and Faber, voice exchange is almost every piece. if you don't know what a voice exchange is, you won't see it, but they're everywhere because it's an idealized way to expand, to prolong a harmony while having counterpoint, right? So if you want to prolong the same chord rather than going like you would in rock music, a voice exchange keeps the same notes with contrary motion and two moving melodic parts. So one of my theory teachers at UCSB would give us extra credit if we used voice exchanges in our assignments. So you had to really think it through what harmony you're prolonging. A voice exchange could just leap like that, or it could have a passing octave in the middle. We'll go to that later, but okay. So, so now I'm going to ask you, since we're going to go fast, you can use octaves. For a tenth, you could also have similar motion to a sixth. But if you do that, like one of the parts is leaning pretty far. So usually third sixth is going to be inside of the tenth. So now you can use octaves, thirds, and sixths. Keep a lot of variety in your motion. Octaves, thirds, and you can use parallel thirds, sixths, and tenths. You can go between them. And end, I'm starting end on an octave. Okay, well, okay, let's see. So, does it sound like a song? Sounds like yeah, Beethoven is so good at counterpoint. I didn't grade part of that. So he went to another teacher to be double graded. His teacher was too, only Beethoven would be like, you're too easy on me, right? That sounded really good. Doesn't that sound like, so when you're analyzing your music, try not to only identify the chord, but see how the way the chords are moving is with counterpoint. And if there's patterns there, theorists call them lips, linear intervallic patterns. So you'll see all these like 6, 8, 10, 8, 6. So if we, let's talk about octaves. So the warm intervals, the thirds and sixths, you can use just all over the place. Crazy. Once you get to perfect intervals or dissonances, you have to take care because the perfect intervals are so cool and stable, right? It's like you don't want to drink something too cold too fast, you get brain freeze. And the dissonant intervals are so hot, there's so much friction between those ratios. Like just scientifically, 15 to 16, there's a lot of friction there. Okay, so we have to be careful how we use the extremes, right? So there's nothing, so people will think you have to be careful with dissonance. You have to be careful with perfect consonances too. They wouldn't know if you ever remember your theory class, you went directly into that perfect fit. You used parallel octaves. They'll take in the AP test, they'll take multiple points off for that mistake. You went into it, you came out of it, and then there's like 3 points off. So I like to think of it, those in-betweens, you have a lot of freedom, but extremes you need to be careful. So with perfect intervals in counterpoint, you'd always want to use contrary motion or oblique motion where you hold apart. But in first species, there's no oblique motion because they're moving at the same time. Then all you have is contrary motion, which makes it easier for the student. Going into a fifth or an octave, you have to be going the opposite direction. Once you have like 4-voice counterpoint, it becomes harder to do that because you have multiple parts moving in different directions. So there's some exceptions, but right, but we're only thinking about 2 voices for now. So now we're gonna. So if you're gonna have an octave, an ideal place to have an octave is if I went from a right is basically, it's almost like you've heard of half notes as dissonances, but you don't want to draw attention to the octave because you don't want the music to feel like it's done before it's done. So you're almost just like passing through it, right? It's a consonance, but your goal is to go from C, like C and E, to E and C. And so you'll see that a lot in music is this octave happening to fill out the voice exchange. Go ahead and, so now you can, I think you did before, but now you can also include octaves in your voice exchanges. Or any octave by contrary motion. Any octave, okay. Let's see. Octave was the parallel tense. Yeah, because it sounds great. Right? And then when you get, you can also like fill in some of the gaps and go to the sixth interval. Okay. Okay. Yeah, and more often they go from a 6th octave than a 10th octave, but nice job. You're doing great with this. Okay, so the fifths, it's the same sort of thing. Fifths will be used a ton with oblique motion because fifths are right next to 6, right? So if I wanted to have a chord that went like this, that's going to be a no-no, right? In rock music, that's fine. It's solidarity. Everything's moving and fits. Boom, boom, boom. It's like a military march. But if you want to have friends having an intimate conversation at a cafe, you don't do that, right? So you would have something more like this. Right? 5/6 motion. And if you do it like this, sounds really nice. Doesn't that sound nice? So the two most common ways to use fifths and counterpoint are either by contrary motion or with this 5/6 motion. And even if you look at the Alfred books, how they teach, it's like, oh, 5/6. Or actually, let's go back to your basic, we have 5/6, 5/6, 5. You have neighbor motions creating a 5/6, 5/6, 5 pattern. The 6s are warm, the 5ths are stable, it's their home chord, right? So if we teach the students, these are chords here, 1, 4, 1, 5, 1, because they look at the counterpoint. What else do we have in that? We have parallel thirds, right? And then if you go to the 5/7 chord, you have contrary motion into that dissonance, which then results right back to the third. So you can train your students to think about harmonic motions melodically. Right. So they're thinking what the chord is and how's it moving. And they'll start to, actually my students who really get into this, they love theory. Like, I don't even have to like work with them much on theory because they're just like, teach me another chord, teach me another scale. Sometimes to the extreme of like modes, octatonic, pentatonic, right? And they're like, one of my students, oh, I just learned the bebop scale. And I just learned like, what? You're going way beyond, like way beyond level 10 CM because they just want more vocabulary to be creative with. So if we treat like theory as vocabulary to understand the music and be creative rather than just, right? Because Gary, when you people do theory in college, it's not like CM where it's just like identify a chord, right? It's much. I hope not. Yeah, I hope not. Right. And so, but I think we can, at a younger age, they can do very simple creative theory exercises that they don't hate theory. Anyway, so now you can include fifths in there. If I want to do a fifth by contrary motion, let's see. So maybe we'll include bleak motion right now, just so you can use more of those fifths. So, and then we'll quickly go into passing tones and suspensions, and then we'll be done. That's a lot of chapters, but this is a lot of material. The thing is, it's interesting. I was teaching this to some AP music theory students, and they could do it, right? And then you have them write in the species counterpoint exercises, and they start to get stuck because they're not hearing it all, right? It's not as intuitive. So having them improvise at the first seems to help. So let's, yeah, now you can use fifths and octaves only by a contrary or oblique motion. Remember, oblique motion means you're repeating a note or holding a note.
Oh, okay.
And then, but mostly use thirds and sixths. Just have some variety with the octaves. Okay, thirds, sixths, and tenths. And then fifths and octaves for some variety. Yeah, you can hear the octave stand out, right? So you really want to like, sneak it in there. Yeah, doesn't that sound great though? So everybody here can go home and do this. I want to make some YouTube videos with this, but because I think it's really fun and everyone can do counterpoint. It's fun. But let's talk about dissonances. So I tell the students, do dissonance in the most dramatic ways you want in your own music. The purpose of dissonance and counterpoint is to find the smoothest way to use that dissonance. So the two ways that are focused on, there's a third way, but the two ways that are focused on are passing notes and suspensions. So let's talk about suspensions because it's really easy after doing parallel thirds and sixths. All you think about, a suspension means one note is held over from the previous chord, right? And then resolves later. If you do a two voicing, that's pretty easy. So you go to a sixth. But if you have the string patch on a keyboard, you'll hear both notes easier. So on the piano, if you want to repeat that note and have a reiterated suspension, that's a 7/6 suspension. So most of the 3 of the 4 suspensions resolve back to an imperfect interval. So go ahead and try that.
Okay,
so just start with an octave.
Okay.
Now go to a 6.
Okay.
Now walk down with the bottom part leading to the top part.
Okay.
The bottom part goes first.
Okay, so here's the octave, okay, now bottom part, okay.
And then right, left.
Okay.
Yeah, isn't that beautiful? The tension is beautiful. And I told my students, you could see a movie where a woman is being cut open. No, listen, and one would be a horror movie, and the same scenario could be a touching movie. Why? She's having a cesarean. The doctor saved her life and the baby's life. And that's what suspensions sound like. They sound like pain, but for a purpose, right? And versus a gory movie where you just like to see somebody cut somebody else open for the joy of it, which is twisted to me, right? Very different, right? One is beautiful and look, he saved her life and the baby's life. And the other one is this twisted, I never want to see that movie. That's a twisted, right? And yet they're both having the same, that little clip is the same. So you look at something like a second, minor second. And I could say, okay, that's my whole song. That's not going to be so lovely, probably. But if I start with the unison, then it's beautiful, right? Isn't that weird? Same interval can be beautiful based off the context. So go ahead and go. Let's do the 2/3 suspension.
Okay,
start with the unison.
Okay.
Think of, there's like 2 singers on one, and then go to a third. Now have the top voice lead the bottom.
Top voice lead.
So yeah. And you can either hold it. If you're going to hold one instead of repeating it, just go fast enough that it leads the volume. Yeah. Okay. And resolve the bottom one down.
Yeah.
So that's how 2/3 suspensions work.
Yeah.
And then let's go to 4/3. Take third and have the bottom one go first. Right, so that's a 4/3 suspension. So you can think of those going back to 3rd and 6th for the speed ones. Now, I want to point something out real quick. The only other type of suspension that's taught in theory is the 9/8, right, which usually happens at a cadence, just a 9th trigger. If I had but that doesn't make much sense with 2 voices. It makes more sense. So, but here's something interesting. If I do go like this, now what happens on that 4/3? That's a 4/3 suspension against the bass. What is it? The alto against the soprano part? That's a 2/3, right? So even though you're technically not labeling it that way in the figured bass, you're labeling it against the bass. But within the intervals, you have 4 to 3 and 2 to 3 at the same time. And so when your students, here's this really tricky thing about when your students are studying like more popular music and it says sus4 to sus. You look and see how it is prepared and resolved. If it's prepared and then the note is a delayed note that resolves to the next chord, that's a true suspension. If they go like this, then it's just a bunch of neighbor notes labeled as a sus chord, right? Like this, the E is just like, right? Then that sus is not really a true sus chord. If I go like this, can anyone tell me what I'm doing there? If I invert what looks like a sus chord, then that's a different type of harmony altogether. That's chordal harmony. Harmony based off fourths. So you see a sus chord and you label it as a sus chord, it could be several different things. It could actually be a suspension. It could be some neighbor notes. It could be a chordal harmony in a more of a jazz context. And so we need to see the context and what the person's doing with the voice leading to actually understand what's happening, or else we're completely misinterpreting. And that's actually true for people. Like when people identify you, it's not just I'm this tall, I'm this, right? It's, oh, I'm a son, I'm a husband, I'm a father, I'm a friend, right? It's all these relational identifications. So if we say, what does the D do in here? Right, oh, it's a passing tone, but in this case, now it's a neighbor tone, right? So, or if I do like this, It's part of the chord. It's a C2 chord. Anyway, so let's try mixing up all this species, suspensions real quick. So if I do like, right? That sounds like a string type or chordal type piece. Try it. So Steve's never done, you've never done this before.
Okay, no.
Right? And look at how well he's doing. So by teaching it systematically, it's not so hard.
Okay.
Okay.
So you want me to start what? Okay.
Start an octave.
Okay.
And then use third, sixth, and tenths, but try to use some suspensions within your thing. All you have to do is think about the resolution.
Okay.
And traditional counterpoint resolutions. You're happy. Yeah, that's good. Nice. You just run a composition, right?
Yeah.
And you'd actually, so yeah, anyway, I think this is fun. The only other distance I want to introduce real quickly is a passing tone. So say I'm going from this third to the sixth, and I don't want it down. So this tritone is going to happen on a weaker part of the meter. And then it's going to resolve. And it's very different if I just jump into the tritone and then I go somewhere else, right? Right? But if I do jump into it, it's dramatic. That's still used in classical music. But in counterpoint, you would learn the smoothest way to do it. So by knowing the smoothest way to do it, that doesn't mean you don't have other options available. But when you're caught in a bind and being creative, you know how to get out of it. Okay, so let's try that. So you can see passing tones.
Okay. That's okay.
Yeah, or you could go from this one.
Yeah.
Which will happen from a 5 to 1. Yeah.
Okay.
Good. So now, Stephen, here's the big thing. You can mix it all. The only other type of, okay, also in counterpoint, we'll talk about neighbor notes. They only happen very quickly because if it happens slowly, it creates a very boring, deep melodic line, right? So what sort of neighbor notes happen quickly in music all the time? Trills, mordents, turns, right? And so those things are pretty quick. And there's other like middle structure neighbor notes that happen. But if you really look at Beethoven and Mozart and what's happening on a deeper level with like on the strong beats and beat 3, and what's happening with the intervals between the bass and the melody, they're probably not going to have tons of neighbor motion on a deeper level. It usually is more of a surface level motion. That's how they were trained in counterpoint. And you see tons of it on the surface because it doesn't take you anywhere. It just, right? It's a little frill. So, and then there's something called a cambiato, which has an incomplete neighbor in it, but we don't need to go into that. So that's the only other type of dissonance introduced in counterpoint, right? Isn't that right? Or is there anything I'm missing? Appoggiaturas are introduced in not in like as much in Renaissance counterpoint, but when you're trying to go into more common practice, then you're going to jump into your dissonances more often and use the appoggiaturas. But you'll resolve them traditionally, but you would set them up more dramatically with a lead. So you could do something like or you could have it on a strong beat, it would be like the more traditional appoggiatura. There's escape tones and all sorts of types of what are called incomplete neighbors. But usually the species counterpoint sticks to like the smoothest options, and then we can study the more dramatic ones that I have on the other sheet. But let's try just mixing up everything you've learned so far. But you're right, appoggiaturas are beautiful.
Okay, so
Yeah, you're Jim. So you can play around with this.
Right.
So does anybody have any questions? Yeah. And that sheet I gave examples of all the different types of non-chord tones, including the ones used during the common practice, which would be, the appoggiaturas, like an accented appoggiaturas, which may not be called appoggiaturas by every theorist, depending on the theorist. And then échappés, which means an escape tone. You come across those a lot. So escape tones are like when I have, if you have a melody that does something like, where it's just going the opposite steps away and then goes to where it would have gone. I tell my students, it's like this, you're going to Disneyland with your family, and you're leaving, and the little kid says, I'm staying at Disneyland, and they're like, forget it, I want my mommy, right? And then, so they go the opposite direction of their goal, and then they go to their goal. So it's called an échappé, escape tone. And one of my adult students is playing a jazz piece and a really difficult arctatum arrangement of it, or and it had an entire escape chord. He's like, how does this? How do you make sense of this? All we could figure out is it was doing something called sidestepping with an opposite direction. It was like, we just called it, well, an escape chord. Why not? You have passing, but all these motions you have with notes, you have with chords. You have passing chords, right? You have neighbor chords. Right, you can have all these events that happen on a very local level can also happen on a deeper level. You can have neighbor keys, right? You can have so these same. So when you study counterpoint, you're learning how different functions happen, and you can apply that to on a larger level. So sorry, that's any other questions or comments?
So counterpoint used not only in polyphonic structure.
It's everywhere.
It's everywhere.
Yeah, in the polyphonic structure, the two melodies are more independent. But when you look at the voice leading of any classical piece of music, it's all the Romantic period, for the most part. Later Romantic period composers might try to break rules more like Wolfer, some other people that were like pre-atonal type composers. But basically, if you look how even just how works, if you thought of that as a block chord and move to the next one, it's using counterpoint. So it's basically voice leading is taken from counterpoint, right? Would you say, Gary? So if you don't understand counterpoint, we actually don't understand what's happening with the chords.
Is that why they say all composers learn from Bach?
Yeah, all of them. So yeah, and then all of them studied the same counterpoint that Bach advocated. Bach wanted people to study this. Isn't that crazy? Yeah, it's sort of like, it's almost like a secret it's like right in the face in a way, but it feels like a secret because we're taught, what happens, one of my teachers said, we began to think more horizontally, which is cool because you can have these cool ninth chords and all stuff, 6/9 chords and sharp 11 and whatever. And that's cool, you can think about how to voice them and have really neat things, but sometimes we forget how chords are connecting to each other. And that's equally important. I don't know. You're an expert professor, Gary. What is your opinion about counterpoint?
Well, music moves through time.
Yes. Yeah.
Organized sound moving through time, so that's kind of counterpoint.
Right. Yes. It's how it's moving through time. Right. There's not an isolated moment. You can't even hear an isolated moment. A sine wave is changes in pressure over time. Right. So if you just heard that one pressured moment without any deviation, it wouldn't mean anything. Your eardrum, your eardrum would be held in a position. So it's the fluctuations, right? So yeah, I think it moves through time, and the way, and even atonal music, they try to look at it as counterpoint. You have to look at it through a different lens because you're not thinking of all these intervals as having these functions, but they're still thinking about motion lines through time, right?
Well, sure, if you look at a piece, say, of Anton Weber,
right?
Highly contrapuntal.
Highly contrapuntal, yeah. And it's just how are these melodies coming together? And it could be, like you said, it could be a polyphonic structure where you have a fugue, or you could take something with just Alberti bass and see that even though there's a melody and a simple accompaniment, the voice leading is a slow, simple counterpoint.
What about chord?
Choral, yeah, definitely choral. Yeah. It's everywhere. Sorry, right? I mean, that's why they do. In some of the theory classes, they just start off with this. They may not explain. I don't. Because I see it in positional awareness, and I get excited to see students use it, and then look at their music and see it. And so I think that that's actually what Bach said in his Intentions and Symphonias. He said, I'm giving you these exercises so you can learn how to play in the cantabile style, right, with songfully, and so you can learn elements of composition, right? So he wanted them to understand the music and to be able to create their own music, and sort of a cycle that was part of classical music, the improvisation and composition, was just something that you would do. Like an artist would maybe copy another artist's painting, but then they're also going to go and make their own painting, or they're going to. Gary, what do you like with repeats? I remember learning on the repeats in classical music. Back to the da capo arias, they would embellish the repeat, right?
Right.
Yeah. So it wasn't, the repeats weren't meant to be boring and you leave them out. They're meant to be a moment of the performer being able to be creative and expressive, and they would fill in gaps with passing tones often, or add neighbor notes, or what else? So
I'm learning Chopin next week, number 3. And I see the compliment between melody and bass.
excellent. Awesome. Yeah, that's good. Anyway, and so we can, I guess, just keep this as an open discussion if you want to keep talking about it other times. I think it's fascinating and fun. To me, it makes theory fun. What do you think, Stephen, as the person, as the guinea pig?
No, this is great. This is, I wish I could have done that. Yeah.
No, you did great.
Okay.
I mean, there's moments that Gary said you sounded like Beethoven.
No.
You're our next Beethoven.
Yeah. All right, thank you. Okay, this is great. Yeah.
Lori brought some banana bread, and I brought some bread and ham and cheese. So please, and Susan brought plates to put it on. So please, please get snacks.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you,
Never
Margaret.
said that everybody-
But there's a here.
Yeah, and actually, that's a little bit.
I've been around for about 10 years, so I guess you were here before I was.
No, actually, we came on here about. Administrator from the UCSB there.
I know it's hard to hold. But thank you.
But then the courts are all.
28 years ago, we got married and I moved for and they're at, you know,